I'm very happy to announce the next speaker to you, Charlie Edwards from the Institute of Security Studies in London. He published in August, and as I mentioned before, I only wrote to him in September, and having a researcher of his caliber, his status, coming on such a short notice is making me very happy and very proud. And please welcome Charlie and his research here on the stage.
Thank you, Christian, very much for your invitation, and I'm delighted to be in Bern today. So last year, I believe Switzerland's National Cybersecurity Centre logged about 60,000 incidents. About 92 were ransomware. This year, as I understand it, Switzerland has a new 24-hour breach reporting tool that came into force. So there is a process now where you are forced to respond to a breach within a shorter period of time than was the case before. And according to the Swiss Federal Intelligence Service, who assessed that Russia plays an active role in espionage and sabotage as well, but that to date, it notes that cyber attacks that threaten critical infrastructure are limited. There is a much greater, broader range across Europe, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But today, I wanted to broaden the aperture. I wanted to talk, and forgive me, Christian, about physical sabotage at a cybersecurity conference. And I do that because I don't believe we can anymore see cyber and sabotage as two very different campaigns when it comes to Russia. Europe is experiencing the most intense era of sabotage since the Cold War. We'll get on to the photos in a second, but there is a definition of sabotage from the UK's new National Security Act. There is no European definition of sabotage. If we were in Switzerland, there are elements of law which reference sabotage, but you would look to the penal code and probably address them at a criminal level, so vandalism, arson, that type of thing. There isn't actually a definition of critical national infrastructure. Switzerland identifies 9 sectors. The UK identifies 13 sectors. France identifies 12. Germany, 9, so-called CRITIS, so it's critical national infrastructure sectors. Italy has sort of 2. One is 11 plus 7 sort of critical and essential services. So even today, we, as a set of European governments, be we in NATO or the EU or not, have quite a different view of what counts as critical national infrastructure. The photo on the left-hand side is Ukrainian sabotage of Russian railways. We know this, and we know this is an attack by the Ukrainians because they told us, and they were very proud to have attacked the Russian railways. The picture on the right is Russian sabotage of the French railway, approximately 150 kilometers to the southwest of Paris, the day before the Paris Olympics. Now, we can only say with a degree of certainty, we would say highly likely, it is Russian sabotage, because until recently, France's government did not have a culture of attribution. So that attack has not been attributed to Russia. But most people within law enforcement and the intelligence agencies would suggest it is at least highly likely that that is Russian sabotage. And the more we face those kind of incidents where plausible deniability reigns supreme, where it is too difficult to determine, where we may not investigate it, or a government may choose not to attribute an attack, the more, I would argue, we normalise Russian sabotage to a point where societies see it as part of their everyday life. Now, when you talk about Russian sabotage, everyone has a map. So here are 4 maps. They're all very useful. ACLED, so that's the Armed Forces Conflict Database. The Economist, that's using IISS data. Leiden University, who did some of the foundational work in this space. And AP News. The problem with those maps is that they are all mapping very different incidents. Some include cyber, some include sabotage, physical sabotage. Some include only convictions, AP News. Some, like ACLED, suspected Russian attacks. So it is very difficult for government, the public, private sector, organizations, to understand what the scale of sabotage is. So what did IISS do? It came up with its own map. Here's ours. So our map is slightly different in that we focus on critical national infrastructure, number 1. So that's communications, energy, government, health, industry, etc. We took the MO, the modus operandi of those attacks, be it arson explosives, anti-dragging, vandalism, electronic attack that has a physical effect. And we then rank them in terms of likelihood. So that's the ring that you can see around them. And you can read this online if you have the time and inclination to do so. And it ranges from a realistic possibility to almost certain. But it is still incredibly challenging, even for researchers in this space, to know what is 100% certain, a fact. And to give you one example, and we'll come on it in a moment, Donald Tusk in May 2024 said it's likely that Russia was involved in a big fire at a shopping centre. A year later, he said Poland knows for sure Russia was involved. So it took approximately 12 months to identify an attack, the perpetrators, run the investigation, identify individuals, and then attribute the attack. And in a just-in-time economy, that is probably too slow. I say probably because we don't know necessarily what the consequences are of the time lag of those investigations. The main point I want to draw your attention today is that European critical infrastructure is vulnerable in Switzerland, in France, in Germany, elsewhere. And there are 4 points that I've highlighted. You can read this, and if you would like the presentation, just say. But the bit I want to try and grapple with this morning is that our aging infrastructure and our lack of investment is one of the single most important issues that we need to address. And we are familiar with this. I realise I'm speaking to a group of experts on cybersecurity who are all familiar and will be more expert than I in how you patch different systems, how the fact that a lot of your systems are built on legacy systems, not necessarily yours, but on public sector legacy systems, be it telecommunications, energy infrastructure, etc., all of which are vulnerable in different ways. And what is striking is that certainly in the European context, many of those are now operated, managed, privately owned. But you see, the thing is, the incentives for that maintenance, for upgrades, is at loggerheads with the profitability of private sector companies. Not always, but it is a clear tension. And if you can defer maintenance, then you do. I mean, why worry until you're attacked, right? The interesting point is that governments are now publishing quite openly where they think some of these key vulnerabilities are. I draw your attention to the Dutch example I have, where they have a commission that set out where some of these vulnerabilities in infrastructure were. And one of the ones they point out was the hydraulic water management system, which relies on an old computer system. It's an age-old story which many of you will be familiar by. What is striking is the scenario they then painted, largely to grab people's attention, which is, should the sluice gates and the various dikes be penetrated, that would result in at least a metre of water across the airport at Rotterdam, rendering it completely useless. Only then, as we understand it, did policymakers take note. So we are aware that these vulnerabilities exist. What most governments have not done is draw up a prioritised list. NATO has, as part of the agreement on 5% spending on defence, 1.5 must be spent on resilience. Now, what's interesting is many countries are waiting for NATO to tell them what they should be spending that money on in terms of critical national infrastructure. And so, therefore, they're not doing their own proprietary work. I mean, why bother when NATO might tell you something totally different? Now, I personally would say that that is the wrong way round, and you want to have done that homework already so that you know what your priorities are and you're investing in it anyway. And the final point, just to draw your attention, is this uneven regulation and fragmented governance across borders. NIS2, I think, genuinely, it is a good piece of work. There may be plenty of you here who disagree. But largely, as a framework for information security, it is a good one. The problem lies in the fact that 13 countries have yet to transpose that directive into their own national law, and 8 of those 13 haven't even decided what the key cyber rules are that they should apply. Now, that feels worrying. It feels like there are a set of vulnerabilities there that we need to take into account, not least because for so many parts of European infrastructure, they are so tightly coupled with other parts of infrastructure across borders as well. So it may be, as I was speaking to one individual at the break, it may be that Switzerland feels like it is in a good place in terms of its investment in critical infrastructure, protection, redundancy, etc. But my question would be is, can you rely on Germany, given that we know what some of the problems are there? Can you rely on Italy? Can you rely on the energy systems that you have been operating with in another country? For example, France. If you can, that's great. I'm not sure anyone is that confident. So just by way of background on some of the key points, some of these will, I'm sure, be familiar to you. Russia's summer offensive failed. It has not been able to take the territory that Putin's generals believe they would do by now. NATO has signaled that it will spend, its member states will spend 5% of defense in 2035. So you have a combination where your offensive in Ukraine is failing, and you know Europeans will spend 5% of defense, that 1.5 plus 3.5%, in about 10 years' time. So if you are Russia, the moment to act is now. And the Kremlin can prevail only by stopping European capitals turn that latent potential, that strength, into usable superiority. And you do that by imposing costs, creating friction, disrupting resilience, eroding support in populations. And you do that through disinformation, cyber attack, and sabotage. There are teams at IISS who focus on those two things. And what you can see from the bar chart is that sabotage activity surges post-2022, so in line with the conflict in Ukraine. And by and large, every time we have seen an attack in Europe, so the drones that were referenced earlier, in Polish airspace, 24 drones, interestingly using a combination of Lithuanian and Polish SIM cards. So the drones were able, at least some of them, to triangulate between cell towers across Polish cities. It never came to that. Many of them crashed or were taken down. But that suggests a pre-planned operation alongside an offensive in Ukraine. So the two are often quite tightly linked. But what we see is from 23 to 24, they quadruple. The big blue part of the bar chart is water treatment plants. And one of the concluding points I want to make, but I'll say it now, is that in many cases, we focus on the incident, and there are good reasons why. We don't often look at the pattern. And it would be interesting to, from a researcher's point of view, to interview all the law enforcement investigators in Finland, Estonia, Sweden, and Germany, where most of those water treatment plants were hit, and say, at any point, did you think, I wonder if this is happening in Estonia or Finland? And in which case, can we see commonality across those places? So how are they doing it, the Russians? Through a mixture of proxies, it's low-tech, it's deniable, up to a point. The background to this is in 2018, two Russian intelligence officers attempt to assassinate Sergei Skripal in the UK, in Salisbury. That marks the point where at least 150, if not more, Russian intelligence services officers are expelled from the country and across Europe. In 2022, after Ukraine is invaded by Russia, at least 400 Russian intelligence service officers are expelled, and with it some of the infrastructure. But they're the ones that we know of. And as an aside, the French intelligence service, DGSI, has said that it thinks that Russia is now reconstituting its Russian intelligence offices in France. At least about a half have been reconstituted. So what did the GRU, who are the primary military intelligence organization who are operating the so-called gig economy, what are they doing? Well, they realized that they didn't have enough people now in country. So they do what they, frankly, have seen in Ukraine, where largely this playbook has played out, but also in the terrorism space as well. And they move to a gig economy that looks to remote task individuals using social media, Telegram in particular. So the so-called Privyet bot, which you can see. And they find that it works really well. In fact, it works much better than I think they probably realized it would do. And they are able to start recruiting individuals for money, and they can start with putting stickers. This is probably the only time I'm ever going to say these words. Excuse my French, ladies and gentlemen. But they're allowed to put stickers, number one, that says "fuck NATO," all over Brussels. That was mission one. They then go back to the handler and they say, look, we've put all these stickers around Brussels. What else do you want us to do? And the handler, who probably is an ex-GRU officer, or at least linked to the Russian intelligence services, says, well, now we want you to go and maybe slaughter some pigs and throw it around the streets. Or maybe tamper with the water treatment plant over here. To which the reply may well be, I've never tampered with a water treatment plant. Can you help me? And at least in one investigation, the water schematic comes straight through with a very clear set of instructions of what to do. All of this is paid, crypto, cash, and it is extremely successful. Except that these are professional amateurs. They're clearly interested in doing something, but it's not quite clear what their training or their skills are. So they are reckless, they're sloppy, they make errors. But the truth is, you can be reckless and sloppy and make errors if your target is vulnerable. And if your critical national infrastructure just requires you burning through some cables and then you've stopped the TGV from operating, then maybe that's all you need to do. And so the playbook that we see in Ukraine is then played out across Europe. The GR unit that's responsible, 29155, or now 161 Center in Moscow, and it's been developed and is being further developed between a mixture of special operations and Russian intelligence services, are the lead, mix of physical ops, arson, vandalism, but looking at single points of failure in European critical infrastructure. And there are some examples. I've touched on the Merivilska 44 shopping center, which is an arson attack enabled and directed by Russian intelligence services. We also then have what I think is an outlier across our data, which is approximately 170 incidents, and that is the DHL massager explosives. 4 packages, one to Birmingham, the US, and in Germany. And what we see from the photo, that's from Minworth in Birmingham, is a set of explosives using phosphorus that catch fire. Now, the intent is still unclear, so was it to burn down the warehouse, because the primary target would have been logistics hubs, or was it to make a plane fall out of the sky? It's not quite clear at the moment. What is clear is the GRU clearly went way OTT on their brief. And that's probably because of the incentive structure within the GRU. So a lot of freedom of maneuver, they were allowed to do it, they operate, and they go ahead and do it. But that incident, which is identified pretty quickly by national security folk both in the UK and the US and elsewhere, results in a call from Biden to Russia, which says that's a red line. You are not about to drop aeroplanes out of the sky. Okay, so Putin now has a red line. If that had been on a passenger aircraft, the cargo, most countries, I think, would have called it an act of terrorism. But we are in a war. Personally, I don't buy the Mark Rutte, we're not either in peace or at war, because there is a war on the European continent in Ukraine, and there is also, adjacent to that, the European theatre where an unconventional war is taking place through sabotage, disinformation, and cyber attack. One of the things that I think the Russians have done quite well is to normalize many of these events to a point where we talk about them, and very rarely do we respond in a clear and determined way until quite clearly a government chooses to do so, be it the Danish when they see drones operating across their airports, the Poles when they see the drones come over. And then legislation and change happens quickly. And the last one I wanted to touch on was the anchor dragging on the Baltic cables. And I only raise this for 2 reasons, briefly. One is that it was clear to the Finnish government that they had proof that that was a deliberate attack, even though we understand 70% or so of cables are damaged, broken every year. There was enough evidence to suggest that this was deliberate. You can't drag your anchor for 100 kilometers without noticing. And they board the Eagle S, they take it back into Finnish waters, but the prosecution collapses on the basis that as the Finnish prosecutors say, this happened in international waters, they can't be prosecuted under Finnish law. So there is a problem that we have. But the deterrent had been created. So just by way of concluding, what are the kind of 5 things that come out of this report? So the first one is treat cyber and sabotage as a campaign. So you have digital reconnaissance, you have pre-positioned access, you have DDoS and info ops that create noise, but you have to watch your proxies who are operating as well. That is quite a difficult combination when the noise is here, but your signal is here. The second, briefly, is that Russia targets the seams, not the silos. Not just one piece of critical infrastructure, but the interface between different areas. Energy, ICT, for example, with the aim to dislay, disrupt, create friction. The third, this is where I might be challenged, success can be measured in terms of recovery, not compliance. So I note that MTTR timings in some sectors is getting longer. Cables under the Baltic Sea are taking longer to repair, mainly because you don't have enough repair ships, but also because they're becoming more tricky. 4, counter deniability with predictable consequences. So is there a package for response immediately? That is a choice that you as a government or the private sector can make, but don't just wait until the incident happens. And lastly, look for the pattern, not the incident. Water treatment plants is an example. I'm sure there are many examples within cyberspace that you as experts will be able to identify. And with that, I'm out of time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Tari. There was so much information of all the things going on your map, on your additional map. Do we have questions in the room, please? Yes, first row. We have a microphone coming down. Mic is running.
Thank you for the talk. So for me as a private citizen, I've so far not observed appetite from the European governments to respond in a clear manner. What kind of tools can you list that they could use? For example, I mean, of course, there's the big option, entering the fray, but clearly that's not the idea. So what kind of options are there? From economical perspectives, but also from more, severe options.
So European governments, shall we say NATO member states, have entered the fray, certainly within the Ukraine theatre, in different ways. Within Europe, we have a pretty good set of options. Everything from sanctions, which are effective up to a point, all the way through to how we respond to a particular incident. Let me give you one example. Some of you may have seen, if only because the British people and media lost their minds, when a fire at a substation near Heathrow took out one of the areas close to the airport. Within, I think, probably an hour, there were questions as to whether this was a Russian sabotage attack. But the UK has been quite used to some of these attacks before, and it has a pretty good playbook whereby it is prepared, unlike other European governments, to attribute the attack should there be an evidence chain. And what you can see along the route is a set of indicators that tell you how seriously the UK government is taking a suspected attack. Very quickly, they ruled it out and they said, no, there is a problem here. And guess what? It was the fact that the substation was poorly maintained. 7 years ago, they had actually identified it as something that needed to be upgraded, and that didn't happen. Deferred maintenance, look what happens. So there is a playbook that the UK government and European governments have. There are tools, sanctions, we can expel people, we can ensure that individuals are aware of the consequences of their actions. We can introduce new legislation. The UK introduced the National Security Act. The Lithuanians changed their legislation overnight so that their armed forces can shoot down drones in peacetime, not wartime. The Polish government decided they could just shoot down flying objects, whatever that means. So there are tools that we have at our disposal. The problem that we have primarily is we don't know what clear thresholds we are working to, number one. We don't know, or we aren't yet joined up as European governments. Forget NATO and the EU for a moment, but as European governments, we're not joined up. And we could do much more in terms of public-private sector collaboration, sharing intelligence, much more, sharing our playbook in terms of incident management, but also being more proactive and assertive to ensure that we're also creating that deterrent effect.
Good. Thank you very much. We're a bit over time already, so thank you very much for being here, Charlie. Some Swiss chocolate for you to take home. Thank you for your presentation.